Hi, and welcome to another edition of Bloody Good Reads. I'm your host, Mark Goddard. This week on the podcast, we're coming over to England. We don't normally have many British authors on here, sadly. I don't know why, unless it's crime related. This week's author is a Cornwall-based author who has her brand new book, Something in the Walls, expected it's coming out this month, later in the month.
This month in the US.
In the US. Okay, cool. And she's also the author of The Silence and the Missing. You just heard her voice there as well. So, welcome to the podcast this week, Daisy Pearce.
Hi. Hello.
Welcome to the podcast. As you know, and as people who listen to podcasts as well know, what I like to do here on Bloody Good Reads is force authors to pick 3 books they love, because I'm a bastard. But what we like to do before we get into your work and your 3 books is, how did you get into the horror genre?
Like lots of other writers, through films originally. Really, when I was much younger, things like Day of the Triffids and Tales of the Unexpected. And then my older brother, used to babysit me, Dominic, and he was about 13 or 14, and he would get me out of bed because there was a scary film on and he was too afraid to watch it by himself. And so I ended up watching The Fog, something about a hand that crawled around the countryside, a disembodied hand that crawled around the countryside. I don't remember much about that. So I was watching Aliens, all these really scary films. And that kind of led me on to borrowing his books, my brother's books, Cujo when I was 8, James Herbert, who I loved growing up, like The Rats, The Fog, The Magic Cottage, which is it's not one of my top 3, but it is a favourite. And then authors like Sean Hudson and Clive Barker, and obviously Stephen King. You remember the covers with the sort of big metallic fonts?
Yeah, the one that pops out. Yeah.
Anything that looked like that on a shelf, I'd be reading that. So all my life, interested in ghosts, interested in poltergeists, and things like that. So it seemed like a natural progression for me when I was thinking about writing to start writing horror books, because I don't really know anything else, and it's a genre that I really enjoy.
And I always say, write what you love as well. So
exactly. Write what you love and write what you know, and that is something I think I could specialist subject a poltergeist for Mastermind or something. I could do that. I could talk about that. So yeah,
some very British choices there, though, of kind of readers, people reading. So obviously we've had Sean Hudson on the podcast before, and some of the leading names there and kind of British. It's nice to hear, because obviously I get so many American authors on here. It's always authors that half know, or
They were all, especially Sean Hudson. He was grisly. Like, I remember him being almost repulsive. Like, his work was so visceral and scary in the way that it was almost like full throttle. Like, the whole thing was like moving so fast. All of his work. A
little bit
and
like
things like
early splatter, like early splatter. Start again. Like early splatterpunk in a way.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Proper gore. And in the way that James Herbert sort of wove magic and ghosts and hauntings, and then, things like The Rats. It was a very British style of writing, and that really appeals to me. It's hard to write horror in the UK at the moment. Publishers aren't very keen on it. And I work in a library, so my day job is in a library, and I've worked in bookshops previously, and what I've noticed is they've taken the horror genre out of bookshops. So it's now listed under thriller, crime. I think it's like thriller, crime, and mystery.
Fiction. Or just as well.
Under fiction. And it's in the US, I think that there's a much bigger. I wouldn't say there's a bigger audience, but it's liked a lot more over there, whereas over here, people are a bit wary of it. It probably seems quite old-fashioned, a bit 80s, a bit James Herbert, a bit, it's all in the past, and it's not clever, and it's not psychological, and it's not. So, yeah, it's. I like writing English horror, but it's finding the audience for it, or proving the audience is there for it. I think it is, but yeah.
I think because you find a lot of British authors heading to America first, going through like Tor and some of the kind of the American ones, and they get picked up by Titan later.
Yeah.
But, I didn't ever thought about, because we went into Waterstones recently, and it's just one shelving unit. That is it.
Yeah.
Some in fantasy, some in thriller, some in horror. So like Dracula's still in fiction, even though it's horror.
They don't. It's funny. It's like they don't want to outwardly advertise it. But I think of horror as having such a loyal audience. It was such a big thing in the 70s and 80s, and even horror films now. You look at the audiences for things like the A24 films, and it's a huge genre, and it's very malleable. Lots of different things can be horror. It's not necessarily like a werewolf novel or a vampire novel. It's all kinds of like weird stuff, brilliant stuff is being written, and it would be a shame, I think, if it was just shoved into crime and thriller, because a crime and thriller reader will pick it up and just think, I don't like this. What's this? This is horror.
Yeah.
It seems a bit, it seems like that might
tricked into
backfire.
reading it in a way. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a thin line between crime and horror, but it's a very different type.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely it is. Yeah. And if you've got any sort of supernatural element in it, that will turn a lot of thriller readers off who want something a bit more like down to earth, or a police procedural, or like a twisty psychological thriller. They don't want to think that there's a ghost roaming about the attic. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tricky to find the right sort of publishers. My publishers have been amazing, incidentally, but yeah, it's hard, certainly in this country. I don't have a publisher here. That's why it's out in the US first, and then hopefully it will find its audience over here as well, ideally. But yeah, it's tricky. So yeah. Sorry, I went on a real rant there.
No. It's true though. It is true. It's hard to find decent bookshops anyway in the UK, let alone try and find the genre.
Yeah.
It wasn't so bad. I used to work for Waterstones years ago, and we had the biggest horror section in the UK in our store.
Yes.
It was several shelving units of American imported books, and you're never going to see that again. You're never going to see it again.
No, I know.
You're dream enough.
And you think about all the old covers, how cool all the old covers were. We touched on it earlier with the sort of metallic writing, and and I think it's a bit of a loss, really. And maybe there are reasons. I don't know what booksellers are saying. Maybe it doesn't sell if it's labeled as horror. Maybe it sells better if it's labeled as mystery or whatever. Don't know. Yeah. I'm not sure what the reasoning is, but yeah, it does. And especially because at the moment it feels like there's a big shift towards like folk horror, which is very
popular,
very British, and lots of like the Stone Circles. You've got all these things that are really ripe for good horror, and it won't get written if publishers won't publish it, won't stand behind it and say, yep, this is, you look at Andrew Michael Hurley, who wrote The Loney, and he wrote Devil's Day, and Barabec, I think he's done recently, and it's very sort of slow blooming, his books, but they are horrifying, and they are scary and tense and weird, and that's very sort of uniquely British, or that weirdness, and there's so much of it in this country, and I don't know, it just feels like an untapped vein, really. Yeah,
we'll get there. Hopefully we'll get back to that.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, before we get into kind of when you started writing, I will ask the awful question, which I like to ask every week. So like we like to do, is force us to pick 3 books they love. What is your first bloody good read?
So obviously it's a hard question. So I've chosen a book that I go back to again and again and again, because it's so it's brilliant. It's From Hell by Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell, which is it's like a graphic novel about Jack the Ripper, about the Jack the Ripper murders. And I originally read it when I was put on some really heavy medication. And so it was a really odd frame of mind to be in, to read about the these things, that are awful things that were happening. But the way it's presented, the book itself is very dark. And I mean, it's dark in terms of the illustrations that it contains, the scenes of Victorian London, the scenes of poverty. It's all very grimy and dark. And then you have these layers of things to discover. I discover like a new thing each read. And then Alan Moore's written this big glossary at the back about like Victorian vernacular and how, like, social class in the Victorian era, and how they did the research for this book. And so it's led me on to all these other books that I've picked up that he's recommended, that I've then gone on to other things reading about. There's a book called The Five about the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper, and I pick it up every December. My daughter pointed it out that I always return to it in the winter. I don't know why. It's a doorstopper, like it's a big book.
It's a chunky one,
and it's so rich in texture in terms of the characters it contains. Obviously, there were real people, and it takes a lot of the facts. It draws a lot of the things that were said, like they know what the last things these women said, or by the last person that saw them. So all of these things are included. Then you've got this mad story about Freemasons, about like visions, apocalyptic visions, and it's incredible. It absolutely blows my mind every time I read it, and I find it's really opened a lot of interest for me in the Victorians. I've just read a book about Bedlam, the hospital, as it was in the kind of 16th, 17th, 18th century. It's like a whole new thing that I've never really discovered about myself before, that I'm really interested in Victorian history. So that's my first book, because I think it's obviously, on one level, it's a horror about Jack the Ripper. It is quite brutal. It is as it has to be, as it needs to be. They don't really sort of skirt around the murders, and I think you have to be prepared for that. But then the women are portrayed as human in it, and then you have the way Queen Victoria is portrayed. The Elephant Man's in it. It's just amazing. I loved it. Yeah,
perfect, amazing choice, and very British as well. I love to have.
Very British, yes.
Unintentionally, probably, but awesome, cool. So, when did you get the urge to start writing yourself? I mean, was it more of a growing up kind of a thing, or was it more kind of college, university?
Definitely growing up. I used to write fantasy, which was dire, awful stuff, because I can't world build the way a good fantasy writer can.
Yeah.
And I was getting so bogged, even at like 9 years old, I was getting really bogged down in like the minutiae of this fantasy realm I was creating, when I was talking about money for 9 pages, because I couldn't quite explain, I was trying to build this world, but I would talk about the armor they were wearing, and there was no sort of plot. It was all so thank God I stopped doing that, because that was awful. And then when I moved to London, when I was about 20, I lived with some students who were all sort of film buffs, I suppose, like film, really into film. So I wrote scripts for a while. Horror, again. I wrote some dreadful, again, awful scripts. But it was writing these scripts that kind of, I realized that what I was doing, I was directing the whole film on the page, which isn't the scriptwriter's job. And I knew that I wouldn't have any control over it once it kind of left my hands. And then I was worried about budget. I was, I'd be thinking, well, if I do this, then it has to have these special effects, or then it has to have, I have to be working within, it's quite limiting, and I couldn't work like that. And I thought, well, if I wrote a novel, I wouldn't have these limitations. I wouldn't have budget constraints. I wouldn't have, have to think about actors or locations or anything like that. I can just write. And so I've been writing since I was about 6. And it really is the only thing I've ever known how to do. I've said this before, but I just don't know what else I would do if I wasn't writing.
Something,
it's such an outlet for me, and it's fun. I'm quite an introvert as well, and I think that really helps. I think a lot of writers are quite insular because it's a job that keeps you on your own for a long time, and then keeps you within a world. Within that so you isolate yourself, and then you isolate yourself again in this world with other people populated by characters that don't exist. And you could be doing this for hours and hours and hours. And so, I think it's the only job that suits me as well. It suits my needs. That kind of, I'm not very good at the promotion of a book, or anything outside of anything that pushes me on social media or anything like that. I'm just like, oh my God, I struggle. But if I'm just allowed free rein to write, perfect. So originally film scripts, which taught me a lot about plot points, like that graph. There's a graph you have with a film script, and there's this kind of like, you have a dip towards the end where, are they going to make it? Who knows? And then it goes up and then it goes down, and it was helpful. I could carry that through to my books, but
So, and your first published novel, so you had a few short stories published and bits before that, but your first one, The Silence, came out 2020.
Yes, in just before the pandemic. So
which is kind of a good thing for writers, because it was when reading started to become popular again.
Exactly. No one had any choice. So it was published, I think, in February of that year, and then lockdown happened in the UK in March. So in terms of promotion, it was tricky. In terms of selling, the book sold really well. I think of it as a ghost story. It was marketed as a kind of thriller mystery, but it definitely, to me, it feels like it is a ghost story. There's a ghost in it, but again, it's psychological thrillers are really, really hard to write, I've discovered. Again, you need a certain kind of brain for them. It's almost like I don't have the attention to detail that it requires. So when people are like, oh, I guessed the twist, I knew what the twist was, I can't put twists in books. I really, really struggle with it. I do, but I really find it hard, because you have to have a certain brain to kind of think of these things, and then lay the right seeds in the, you have to seed things in, and
red herring it.
God, red herring it. I know. And I think this comes from reading, as going back to what we were saying, the big kind of horror authors of the 80s, everything was bombast. Everything was, this happens and then this happens, and there's no subtlety, and there's no like underlying meaning. His head's going to come off, that kind of thing. And so, and so I tend to kind of hark back to that every time. That's my kind of comfort zone almost. And readers and sort of audiences need a bit more than that, I've learned. Publishers want a bit more than that, I've learned. So I tell you who does it really well. contemporary writer, Adam Neville,
Yeah,
does that kind of almost like his books accelerate. That's the only way I can think of describing it. They all accelerate. They don't slow down or try and throw you off or try to make you think you're going a different way. It's a straight line and you're going down it whether you like it or not, kind of thing.
Yeah. No matter how brutal it gets, you're going to get down this
No matter how brutal it gets, you have to hang on and you have to just keep going. So The Silence came out, and then I had another book, The Missing, that came out a few months later. Yeah.
Very, very quick succession.
Really quick. And I think it's because The Silence sold so well. They were like, oh, let's rush this out. And The Missing didn't do as well, which is a shame because I really like writing it. But again, it was a funny time. The world had gone mad and people were kind of reassessing their lives. And I think it was a hard time to have to present anything new to people and be like, look, this is exciting. Look what I've done. And everyone's like, you realize there's a pandemic going on. So, but I'm immensely proud of both of those books. And, you know, when I was first published and I opened the box, you get this box of your books and you open it up and it's the strangest thing in the world. I'll never get used to it. Never. I've just had Something in the Walls delivered and just opening it up and seeing it's just like, who is this person? You know, it doesn't, it's very strange. It's
why have I received
very weird. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, very proud moment, very strange moment. And again, you know, I'm really grateful that people want to read it. So, and this particular novel, Something in the Walls, has had some really good reviews. So I'm hoping it finds an audience. I'm hoping people like it, people pick it up and like it. Yeah.
Well, before we get to your brand new book, let's go on to your second choice. So, what is your second bloody good read?
It is a book that the Reddit Horrorlit community have never sort of steered me wrong with recommendations. And somebody recommended The Ruins by Scott Smith. And I thought, oh, yeah, I'll give that a go. Have you read it? I nearly fell off my chair. It's like having an extended panic attack.
I've seen the movie, but I haven't read the book.
So Scott Smith, as far as I can tell, has only written 2 books. He's an American author. Both of them, one of them is like a panic attack, and the second one's like a heart attack. So it's again, it's like unrelenting horror, not gore, but well, there is, but
it's very tense,
and it's very tense, and there's no plot armor. So lots of books have this thing called plot armor, where I don't know if you know or your listeners know, it's when things are protected in a book. Children mostly are protected, dogs usually, obviously. There's none
even dad's getting less than this now.
There's no plot armor. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know, and things get bad, and you think, wow, things can't get any worse now. And then things get worse, and you're like, how is he doing this? And it's one of my favorite tropes. I say that a lot. I've got lots of favorite tropes, which is kind of tourists abroad mess with something they shouldn't be, go somewhere they shouldn't, pick up an object they shouldn't be touching. It's that kind of thing where it's just like, wow, you know something dreadful is going to happen. And so he sets it up in this way that you say, okay, I know what's going to happen, you know, well, dear. But it's horrifying in the very truest sense of the word. I loved it. I'll never read it again. I've actually given my copy away because I thought I will never pick that up in a million years and look at it again. But
I've done it once. Don't have to go through.
Once was enough. But I fully recommend it. I mean, it's incredible writing because you can't put it down. You can't stop reading. You're kind of repelled, and you think, okay, you know, maybe I'll just put this to one side and pick it up later. It's again, it's that momentum. He builds this momentum whereby you can't stop, and so you have to keep going. And it was just unrelenting. Like, yeah, I don't want to give anything away, but yeah, it's incredible horror, and probably the closest you'll get to that 80s that we were talking about earlier, that kind of
horror, like
brutal 80s, like raw horror. Yeah. So he did The Ruins, which is the one I'm talking about, and then another book called A Simple Plan, which is it's just panic inducing. And then he just hasn't written anything since. And I just do wonder if he just burnt out after those two books. Like, no, that's enough. Giving myself an aneurysm. It was just
I've got my movie money now. I don't need to write another book.
Yeah, don't need it anymore. So yeah, he was. I'd like him to write something else, but at the same time, maybe draw a line under it, Scott. Leave it alone. But yeah, really good, really good.
Good choice. Good choice.
Thank you.
Your brand new book, Something in the Walls, which is released. It's coming out on the 25th in the US.
25th of February, yeah.
Yeah, it comes out on the 25th, but by the time this podcast comes out, it should be on release week. Tell us a bit about the brand new book without spoiling too much. Yeah, take it from
there. So just going back to the things I particularly like is poltergeists. Things that happen I like domestic horror. I like horror that takes place in a home, almost within a family unit. So, and I think there's a lot of horror you can get from that anyway. You know, homes aren't necessarily safe or secure or nice places to be. And then if you throw a supernatural element in on top of that, it's this kind of multi-layered story. So I wrote it 2 years before the pandemic. I started writing it, just getting back to the pandemic. And my thinking process was, how horrible would it be to be on a government lockdown in a haunted house? And so in the book, the weather is almost as much of an enemy, or is as hostile as the entity, let's say, because I really like books where the landscape or the weather is also against them. It's all, it's also against the characters. They're kind of fighting against like the environment they're in, almost, in as much as they're fighting against anything else. I took a lot from the story about the Enfield poltergeist.
Yeah.
And the Bell Witch in Tennessee, and Ghost Watch. Do you remember Ghost Watch?
I remember Ghost Watch. Yeah.
So it's that. It's like a working class family it's almost like a chaotic household, and then within that household you have voices and noises. And there's a journalist in the book who goes to investigate, and he takes along a child psychologist, because what I think is also quite interesting in books, and probably scariest of all, having a daughter myself, teen girls are really genuinely quite scary. So, and they are usually the focus and the target of a poltergeist haunting. It's something to do with adolescence. You look at Carrie or the Enfield story or the Bell Witch or anything like that. It's all, linked to teenage girls. So it features a teenage girl called Alice and a child psychologist who goes along with a journalist to try to figure out what's going on. And I don't want to give too much away. But yeah, it's there's almost like a lockdown, because it's set during a heat wave in the 80s in Cornwall, which is my sort of growing up period. So, and it's like set in an old Cornish town, which is quite run down. There's a lot of unemployment. There's a lot of distrust in the government. There's lots of like closed shops, and so
It's set in that kind of a little bit like the Enfield haunting is, council estate and council family.
Exactly, yeah. And you have like outside influences and like mass hysteria. I'm quite interested in the idea of like that the notion of a crowd being influenced by each other rather than whatever's going on around them. Like the dancing plague. What was it? Was that what it was? There was like a dancing plague, like in the medieval era, where they think it was some rye bread that they were eating had made them all go a bit mad and start dancing, and they couldn't stop. And it's spread amongst this town of people, and it's the way that you have it. It's almost like a contagion, where once one person starts believing it, another person will start believing it, and then another, and suddenly it's bigger than you can control. And then I like the idea of that. So that's definitely like a root of the story, is this idea of minds being tainted by an idea or by gossip. Yeah.
Amazing. Awesome. So that is Something in the Walls. That is out February 25th. Go and order it now. Obviously, it comes out around the same time as it comes out. Buy it now.
Yeah.
And you go and support Daisy and her work as well. Go and have her books as well. Cool. So before we close up, let's go to your third and final read. So what is your third and final Bloody Good read?
It is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buhlman.
Not heard of that one.
So it's a medieval horror, which I picked up thinking, this looks quite good, I'll read this. And it's incredible. It's like huge in scope, not in size. It's not a particularly long book. And it is a very funny book as well, which, considering the subject matter of like the Black Death, this sort of priest and all these gods and angels, it's like huge in scope, but sort of contained, beautifully characterized. And there's plagues and there's devils, and I think the reason I enjoyed it so much is because I didn't know what to expect. I went in completely blind. And then I don't think I've read much medieval horror. I don't think it should be a bigger genre, because actually it's quite a rich, everybody was very sort of God-fearing, fearful of sin, fearful of plague. Women were stoned to death for looking the wrong way. The whole sort of area of it could be, not by me. I'm not going to do it. I've got no attention to detail. I'm not going to be doing that. But it's really interesting. So even the vernacular he uses is of its time, of that time, and it's about this journey. I think it's it's like a gay alcoholic priest and a girl called Delphine, who is like, she's almost celestial. And then this man, I think he's a knight, and they go on like a journey across France. I think it's set in France in the Middle Ages. I'm not selling it very well, but I don't want to say Lovecraftian, because I think that's so overused. But in the sense that you have these giant creatures and visions, and there's a lot of religious iconography, but it's not overt particularly. It didn't strike me as a religious book. It's absolutely fascinating and funny and lyrical. Like, it's beautifully written. He's a brilliant writer. So that's my third choice. It was one that I picked up, thought I'll give this a go, not expecting anything from it, which is a lovely thing to happen. I love it when that happens. You know, often I'll be so I've got a big, as everyone does, big pile by my bed of books that I'm going to read, books on my list, books that have been recommended. And so it's not often you get the chance to kind of go like, oh, just pick something up and see what that's like.
Yeah.
And it isn't like anything I've ever read before. And I think, you know, nowadays, I sound like I'm about 100, but nowadays that's quite a hard feat to write something that really stands out and is really original. And I have talked about it before because I just love it. I talk about it to everyone I meet. It's just it's an incredible work, and it is a work. It feels like at the end you've traveled with them. You've like with Frodo, you know, that feeling of I've been on this journey with you. That's how it feels. Amazing. I love it. Yeah,
brilliant. 3 very good and very different bloody good reads this week. So well done for them ones. Yeah, they're really, really good picks. So go and check them out. You know, obviously they'll be in, you know, description below as well. So do check them out. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast this week.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, that's okay. Where can people find you if you'd like to be
found? Yeah, find me. That's fine. Just don't be weird. But yes, find me. I'm on Instagram. I have a website. I don't think I've updated it recently, but it's definitely there somewhere. And I've got an email address, so I'm around. And yeah, I don't actually have an agent currently. So no agent and no publisher in the UK, but so if you do need to contact me, don't go through my agent, go through my website, I guess. And then yeah. There
you go. We'll put all the socials into the link below as well, so go and check them out. Again, thank you to Daisy for coming on the podcast this week. As always, a huge shout out to our sponsors for the podcast. Got Budgeons and Dragons, which is an amazing improv podcast which follows Dungeons and Dragons rules. As I've mentioned before, I'm on that podcast coming up in a few episodes' time. That I'll link into this bit as well. Great bunch of guys. If you like bizarre comedy and kind of, you know, stupidness, you'll love the podcast. Also, a huge shout out to our main sponsor, Audible Book Club. They're the UK's biggest and best horror and thriller book box service, bringing the ones of a haunted bookshop straight to your door each month. As you know, I absolutely adore Audible Book Club. They've been sponsoring us since the start of this podcast, before this podcast, back when we're still doing Snake Bite Horrorcast. They do the Bare Bones box, which is just the books, or you can get a Full Guts box. I always do this. I don't know why I can't have my mind. A Full Guts box, which is a brand new book, a possibly haunted second-hand book, either an indie title, a magazine. You also get UK snacks, UK drinks, and yeah, you always get an amazing array of brand new releases in this box as well. So go and check it out. We had Clay's new book come out in this box. We just had out in January, and hopefully get some decent titles in the February box. We've got quite a few big titles coming out for horror in February. So yeah, use the code Bloody Good Reads at checkout. That's a Audible Book Club at craigjoy.com. It's in the link below as always. You can always catch me over on the social medias at Bloody Good Reads, on Twitter, on Facebook, over on Instagram, TikTok. I'm on there now doing stuff. Yay. You get to see my ugly face every day. You can also catch us on our sister podcast, It's Look the Screen. It's our monthly movie podcast. We are starting our 90s series. We thought we'd give it a little bit of a change. And it's Taz's choice for February, so they have picked Face Off and 10 Things I Hate About You. Not horror, but here we go. It's what happens when you give people the choice. But she did win the quiz, so fair enough. Yeah, so keep on looking at the feed. We've got so many more offers booked in for next few months, so you've got some more stuff coming your way. But as always, I've been your host, Mark Goddard, and I'll see you next time.